The automatic doors to the emergency department slid open with a mechanical hiss, but no one walked through immediately. For a second, the vestibule seemed empty. Then, she stepped into the light. 10-year-old Leah stood framed by the aluminum jambs, alone, her posture bent under a weight that shouldn't have been hers to carry. In her arms, she held 4-year-old Sophie, not with the casual grip of a sibling playing a game, but with the grim, locked-jaw determination of a soldier carrying a wounded comrade. The chaos of the waiting room, the coughing, the murmuring TV, the crying baby in the corner, seemed to mute itself around her. She didn't look around for a parent. She didn't cry for help. She simply walked forward, bypassing the snaking line of adults at the reception desk with a terrifying, singular focus. Behind the triage glass, Alice, the head nurse, looked up from her screen, expecting to see a lost child wandering away from her mother. Instead, she saw a delivery. Alice would later say that the first thing she noticed wasn't the girl's face, but the sound. Amidst the low hum of the waiting room, there was a specific rhythmic squeak of rubber sneakers on linoleum, underscored by a heavy, wet rasping sound that didn't belong to the walker. It was the friction of air forcing its way through a closing throat, a noise that instantly cuts through the ambient noise of a hospital. Leah moved with a stride that was too long for her legs, her knees buckling slightly with each step, but never stopping. Her face was drained of all color, a stark, pale canvas where sweat had plastered strands of dark hair against her forehead. But her eyes were what made Alice freeze. They weren't wide with panic. They weren't searching the room for reassurance. They were fixed on the triage desk with an unsettling, glassy calmness that adults usually only wear after the disaster is already over. She looked like she had walked out of a storm, drenched not in rain, but in a cold, focused terror that had burned away everything except the need to keep moving. Alice's gaze dropped to the burden in Leah's arms. Sophie was limp, her small head lolling back against Leah's shoulder. One arm dangled uselessly, swaying with the rhythm of Leah's gait. Even from 10 feet away, through the gap in the plexiglass, Alice could see the blue tinge bordering the little girl's lips. Cyanosis. It was the color of oxygen starvation, a shade that every triage nurse knows intimately and fears instantly. Sophie wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. She possessed the distinct, heavy stillness of a compromised airway, a silence that screams louder than any cry. A security guard near the entrance, a man named Miller, who had spent 20 years ushering drunks and anxious parents into line, stepped forward instinctively. He raised a hand, his mouth opening to say something about the queue, about waiting your turn. Leah didn't even blink. She didn't slow down. She shifted her weight, stepping around his outstretched arm with a fluidity that suggested he was nothing more than a piece of furniture. She didn't acknowledge him because, in her world right now, he didn't exist. The only thing that existed was the triage desk and the woman sitting behind it. Inside the triage booth, Alice's initial reaction was a flash of irritation, a reflex honed by years of people trying to cut the line for a sprained ankle or a fever. Wait your turn, she thought. But the thought died before it fully formed. As Leah cleared the final distance, the details sharpened. The sweat on Leah's neck, the way her knuckles were white, gripping the fabric of Sophie's shirt so hard the material looked ready to tear. The absolute absence of an adult trailing behind them. The air in the triage bay seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alice stood up, her chair rolling back with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. She didn't ask for a name. She didn't ask for an insurance card. She reached for the latch on the swinging door of the booth just as Leah reached the counter. Leah didn't say hello. She didn't ask for help. With a final, shuddering exhale, she leaned over the high counter and lowered Sophie onto the cool laminate surface. It was an awkward, desperate maneuver, the height of the desk forcing Leah to stand on her tiptoes to get her sister safely down. As the weight left her arms, Leah's body seemed to recoil. Her arms, freed from the burden they had carried for who knew how long, fell to her sides and immediately began to tremble violently. It wasn't a shiver. It was the physiological crash of muscles that had been pushed past failure and held there by sheer will. She stood there, chest heaving, watching Alice's hands move toward her sister, her job done, her watch ended, waiting for the adults to finally take over. The sliding glass window of the triage bay was open, but for a long, suspended second, no sound passed through it. Alice leaned forward over the laminate counter, her hands instinctively reaching for her stethoscope, her mind already cycling through the standard pediatric questions she used to coax information out of frightened siblings. She expected a whimper. She expected a tearful, incoherent plea about a tummy ache or a fall on the playground. She was prepared to decode the terrified babble of a 10-year-old girl who had just dragged her sister into a hospital. She was ready to be the translator between a child's fear and medical reality. But she never got the chance to ask the first question. Leah took a breath. It was a sharp, jagged intake of air, but when she released it, her voice didn't shake. It didn't crack or rise in pitch. It emerged with a terrifying, flat clarity that cut through the antiseptic air of the booth like a scalpel. "Patient is in anaphylactic shock," Leah said. The words hung in the air, disjointed from the image of the child speaking them. Alice blinked, her hand freezing halfway to the phone. A 10-year-old shouldn't know how to pronounce anaphylactic, let alone diagnose it. But Leah wasn't finished. She wasn't just naming the problem, she was handing over the chart. "Airway constriction began approximately 12 minutes ago," Leah continued, her eyes locking onto Alice's with an intensity that felt almost physical. "Stridor is present. Urticaria is visible on the torso and neck. I administered 1 dose of epinephrine, 0.15 milligrams, via autoinjector." Alice felt a cold prickle of gooseflesh rise on her arms. This wasn't the frantic rambling of a witness. This was the precise, clipped report of a first responder. Leah lifted a trembling hand and pointed to her sister's small, denim-clad leg. "Injection site was the right vastus lateralis," she stated, the Latin anatomical term rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "Time of administration was 2:14 p.m. It has been 18 minutes. There has been no regression of symptoms. The airway is failing." The effect on the room was instantaneous and absolute. Behind Alice, the rhythmic clacking of the unit clerk's keyboard stopped abruptly. A resident physician, who had been walking past with a lukewarm coffee in hand, froze in mid-step, his head snapping around to look at the source of the voice. The casual, low-level hum of the emergency department evaporated, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. They were staring at a girl who barely reached the top of the counter, yet she had just commanded the room with more authority than the attending physician. Alice looked down at Sophie. She saw the truth of Leah's report written on the child's body, the struggling chest, the blue lips, the faint, high-pitched wheeze of air trying to force its way through a closing pipe. She realized then that she wasn't dealing with a frantic sister. She was dealing with a provider who had run out of resources. Leah had done everything right, and now she was handing off the command. Alice didn't ask, "Are you sure?" or "Where are your parents?" She slammed her hand onto the red button mounted on the wall behind her. The harsh, blaring alarm of the Code Blue system erupted, shattering the stillness. "Code Blue, pediatric triage," Alice shouted, her voice overlapping with the mechanical wail. "Anaphylaxis, airway compromise, get the crash cart." The paralysis in the room broke. The double doors to the main ER swung open with a crash as the trauma team swarmed toward the desk. Nurses, doctors, and respiratory therapists flooded the small space, a chaotic ballet of urgency. In the center of it all, Leah did something that broke Alice's heart. She didn't cling to her sister. She didn't scream. She simply took one large step back, pressing herself against the beige wall to clear the path for the professionals. She stood there, small and gray-faced, her eyes flicking up to the analog clock on the wall, silently counting the seconds that had passed since the injection, tracking a timeline only she fully understood. The journey from the triage desk to the trauma bay is a distance of perhaps 40 feet, but in a crisis, it transforms into a blur of velocity and noise that distorts time itself. The hallway erupted into motion. It became a slipstream of shouting voices, the shrill squeal of gurney wheels spinning on polished linoleum, and the frantic, rhythmic beeping of the portable monitor that had been hastily thrown onto the bed. Sophie was no longer just a little girl. She was a bundle of failing biology wrapped in a white sheet, surrounded by a phalanx of blue scrubs moving at a dead sprint. Leah did not run. Running is the gate of panic, of flight, of losing control. Leah marched. She moved alongside the rushing current of medical staff with a stride that was terrifyingly composed. Her small sneakers slapped against the floor in a rapid, steady cadence that kept pace with the rolling bed, but her upper body remained rigid, her eyes locked forward. She wasn't chasing her sister, she was escorting her. She moved like a guardian spirit bound to the gurney by an invisible tether, refusing to let the chaos of the hospital separate them. A resident doctor, young and flushed with the adrenaline of the alarm, peeled off from a side room to join the rush. He saw a child in the middle of the hallway, a civilian in a zone of combat, and his instinct was to clear the obstruction. He stepped into Leah's path, his hand raising in a universal gesture to stop, his mouth opening to shout a command about staying back, about waiting in the lobby. He saw a 10-year-old girl who needed to be protected from the trauma she was about to witness. Leah didn't even break her stride. She didn't look at his face. She saw him not as a person, but as an obstacle in the geometry of her mission. With a fluidity that suggested she had anticipated his movement before he made it, she dipped her shoulder and sidestepped him. It was a maneuver of pure efficiency, dodging his outstretched arm with the authority of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She slipped past him before he could close his hand, leaving him grasping at empty air, stunned by the sheer force of her determination. She wasn't a visitor. She was part of the team, and she had no time to explain that to him. They burst into Trauma Bay 1, the largest room in the department, designed for the worst catastrophes. The room exploded into a symphony of organized chaos. Overhead lights flickered to blinding full brightness, casting harsh, shadowless illumination over the bed. The air filled with the sharp, tearing sound of Velcro straps being ripped open, the hiss of high-flow oxygen valves being cranked to maximum, and the metallic clatter of instruments being laid out on steel trays. Leah did not crowd the bed. She didn't cling to Sophie's hand or get in the way of the nurses trying to secure IV lines. She knew the protocol. She moved instantly to the far corner of the room, near the supply cabinets. It was a strategic position, out of the sterile field, out of the physical path of the doctors, but with a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the overhead cardiac monitor. She stood with her back against the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest to suppress the tremors that were trying to reclaim her limbs. She became a statue in the corner, a silent sentinel watching the data stream. Dr. Evans, the attending physician, swept into the room with the heavy, commanding presence of a man who had spent 30 years fighting death. He took his place at the foot of the bed, his eyes scanning Sophie's graying form. "Talk to me," Evans barked, his voice cutting through the noise. "What do we have?" Alice, who was already cutting away Sophie's shirt to place cardiac leads, didn't look up. "Female, 4 years old, anaphylaxis, airway compromise, history of exposure unknown." "Meds on board?" Evans demanded, his hands moving to palpate Sophie's stomach. "1 dose epinephrine, 0.15 milligrams, administered 18 minutes ago," Alice recited, repeating the data Leah had given her. Evans paused, his hands stilling for a fraction of a second. He looked at the paramedic crew who had just walked in from the ambulance bay, confused. "Administered by who? EMS didn't bring her in." Alice swallowed. She knew what was coming. "The sister," she said, nodding toward the corner. "She diagnosed it. She administered the EpiPen. She provided the timeline." The room seemed to stutter. Dr. Evans looked up, his gaze following Alice's gesture to the small, dark-haired girl pressed against the wall. He looked at Leah, seeing the dirty sneakers, the tear-stained shirt, the child who should have been in 4th grade. Then he looked back at Alice, his brow furrowing in a dangerous expression of skepticism. "You called a full code blue and cleared a trauma team based on the assessment of a 10-year-old? Evans asked. His voice wasn't angry, but it was heavy with doubt. In medicine, doubt is a thief. It steals seconds. And as Evans looked from the child in the corner to the child on the bed, hesitating to order the next aggressive step based on the word of a grade schooler, the timeline Leah had been tracking in her head ran out. The skepticism on Dr. Evans' face lasted exactly 3 seconds, the time it took for him to place the bell of his stethoscope against Sophie's small, heaving chest. In a trauma bay, silence is usually the goal, the sign of a stable patient sleeping or a procedure finished. But the silence Evans heard through the earpieces was the wrong kind. It was the terrifying, muffled quiet of a room with the doors slammed shut. He moved the stethoscope to her throat and heard it, the high-pitched, musical whistle of Strider. It sounded like wind screaming through a cracked window in a storm. It was the sound of a windpipe that had swollen from the diameter of a dime to the width of a coffee stirrer. He pulled the sheet down, exposing Sophie's torso. The evidence was mapped out across her skin in angry, raised welts. The urticaria, hives, had ballooned across her stomach and chest like a topographical map of a disaster. They were bright red islands on skin that was turning a terrifying shade of mottled gray. The blue tint around her lips wasn't a trick of the light. It was deepening, a visual siren signaling that the oxygen in her blood was plummeting. "No air movement in the bases," Evans announced, his voice shedding the doubt instantly, replaced by the clipped, hard tone of command. "Upper airway is closing. That first dose is washed out. We are behind the curve." The atmosphere in the room tightened, snapping from evaluation to rescue. The timeline Leah had recited in the triage booth was accurate, which meant the epinephrine she had administered 20 minutes ago had done its job, but its half-life was over. The anaphylactic reaction was surging back, fighting to close the door that the medicine had briefly propped open. "Get another 0.15 milligrams of epi on board, IM, right now," Evans ordered, stepping back to allow the nurse access to the thigh. "Get an IV established. I need fluids wide open. And get the intubation tray ready just in case." "What's her weight?" "She looks small. Maybe 14 kilos? The nurse grabbed a syringe, her eyes darting between the child and the weight-based dosing chart on the wall, trying to make a rapid calculation. In pediatric emergency medicine, weight is everything. A guess can kill. Too little medicine does nothing. Too much stops the heart. 18.2. The voice came from the corner, cutting through the beep of the monitors. Leah hadn't moved from her spot against the wall. She didn't shout. She didn't wave her hand. She simply stated the number with the absolute certainty of an accountant reading a ledger. "She was weighed yesterday morning," Leah said, her eyes fixed on the nurse holding the syringe. 18.2 kilograms. The nurse froze, the needle hovering inches from Sophie's leg. She looked at Dr. Evans. For a heartbeat, the hierarchy of the room hung in the balance. The veteran doctor looked at the 10-year-old girl in dirty sneakers. He looked at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the way she stood guard over the procedure. He realized in that moment that this child was the only expert on the patient in the room. She hadn't just brought her sister in, she had been managing the case alone for an hour. Evans didn't argue. He didn't ask her to verify. He looked at the nurse and nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Calculate for 18 kilos, he said. "Do it." The nurse adjusted her grip, verified the volume, and drove the needle into Sophie's thigh. The second dose of epinephrine flooded the system. Now, the room entered the most agonizing phase of emergency medicine, the wait. There is a specific, heavy texture to the air when a medical team waits for a drug to work. Eyes shifted from the patient to the overhead monitor, watching the jagged green line of the heart rate and the blue number of the oxygen saturation. The numbers were bad. Heart rate too fast, oxygen too low. They needed the heart to slow down and the oxygen to climb. They needed the biology to respond. Leah watched the screen too. From her corner, she could see the numbers that dictated her sister's fate. She understood them. She knew that 92% oxygen was terrifying, and 88% was catastrophic. She watched the numbers flicker. Alice, standing by the head of the bed managing the airway, stole a glance at the older sister. Leah's face remained a mask of unnatural stoicism. She wasn't crying. She wasn't praying. She was working. But then Alice looked down at Leah's hands. They were crossed over her chest, tucked tightly into her armpits, but Alice could see the tension. Leah's hands were balled into fists so tight that the knuckles were stark white, the skin stretched to its limit. Her fingernails were digging into her own palms, anchoring her to the ground, containing a scream that she refused to let out because she knew it wouldn't help. It was the only crack in the armor, the only physical betrayal of the terror that was eating her alive from the inside out. The electronic chirp of the pulse oximeter changed its tone. It was a subtle shift, a variation in pitch that might have been lost in a cafeteria or a busy subway station, but in the trauma bay, it was a choir singing a hymn of salvation. The numbers on the screen flickered, the red digits of the oxygen saturation climbing from a terrifying 88 up to 92, then 95. The jagged green line of the heart rate began to space out, slowing from a frantic sprint to a manageable gallop. The harsh, whistling sound of the stridor softened, replaced by the deeper, rhythmic sound of air actually reaching the bottom of the lungs. The crisis didn't end with a shout or a cheer. It simply receded, like a high tide pulling back from the shore, leaving the room wet, messy, and quiet. Dr. Evans straightened up, pulling the stethoscope from his ears and draping it around his neck. He watched the monitor for 10 solid seconds, confirming the trend, then nodded to the room. The tension broke. The respiratory therapist stepped back from the head of the bed. The extra nurses began to peel away, returning to their other patients, leaving only the essential debris of a saved life, wrappers on the floor, open drawers, and the smell of rubbing alcohol. Alice remained. She finished taping the IV line to Sophie's arm, checking the flow, before turning her attention to the corner of the room. Leah hadn't moved. The room had decompressed, but the 10-year-old girl was still vibrating with a tension that refused to dissipate. She was still tracking every blink of the monitor, her eyes darting from the screen to her sister's chest, counting respirations. Alice walked over slowly, keeping her hands visible and her posture low, treating Leah not like a visitor, but like a fellow clinician who had just run a marathon. She pulled a rolling stool over and sat down, bringing herself to Leah's eye level. "She's stable, Leah," Alice said softly. "The medicine worked. You can breathe now." Leah didn't exhale. She nodded once, a jerky mechanical motion. She didn't look at Alice. She kept her eyes on Sophie. "For now," she whispered. "We need to call your parents," Alice said, pulling a notepad from her pocket. "Do you know the number?" Leah recited the 10 digits instantly, without a pause for thought. "It's my dad's cell, but he won't answer." Alice paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "Why won't he answer, honey? Is he at work?" "No," Leah said, her voice sounding incredibly old. "We were hiking. The Ridge Trail. There's no service past the parking lot. They're still up there. They don't know she's here." The pieces of the puzzle began to click together in Alice's mind, forming a picture that was far more terrifying than she had realized. The Ridge Trail was a popular but rugged path on the edge of the county. It was steep, rocky, and utterly isolated. "Leah," Alice asked, her voice dropping to a whisper, "where were you when she got stung?" "Mile marker 4, Leah answered, "by the old creek bed." Alice felt the blood drain from her own face. Mile marker 4. That was over a mile from the trailhead, and the trailhead was another half-mile from the nearest road where a car could be flagged down. She looked at Leah's shoes. They were standard-issue canvas sneakers, now caked in fresh mud and dust. She looked at Leah's legs, seeing the scratches from briars and the angry red lines where branches had whipped against her skin. "You carried her?" Alice asked, the question barely making it past her lips. "She couldn't walk," Leah said simply, as if that explained everything. "Her throat started making the noise. I knew I had to run, but she got heavy." Alice looked at the sleeping 4-year-old on the bed. Sophie was small, but she was dead weight, 40 pounds of limp, unconscious child. And Leah was a stick figure, a wisp of a girl who couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds herself. The physics of it didn't make sense. To carry that weight over that terrain in that amount of time was impossible. It was a feat of endurance that would have broken a grown man. "You carried her for a mile," Alice repeated, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the effort. "I had to stop twice," Leah admitted, a flash of shame crossing her face. "My arms wouldn't work. I dropped her once. I tried to catch her, but I fell." She looked down at her knees, where the denim was torn and bloody. "I wasted time." "You didn't waste time, Leah," Alice said, reaching out to touch the girl's shoulder. "You saved her life." As the adrenaline finally began to bleed out of Leah's system, the physical toll crashed down on her. The unnatural stillness that had held her upright evaporated. Her legs, which had marched her sister to safety, suddenly forgot how to hold her up. A tremor started in her thighs and shot up her spine. Her face went from pale to a translucent gray. She didn't faint, but she folded, her knees giving way as the exhaustion took her. Alice caught her before she hit the floor, guiding her into the rolling chair, watching as the girl who had commanded a trauma room suddenly became a small, trembling child who had simply run until she couldn't run anymore. The silence in the trauma bay had shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a room holding its breath for a dying child, but the mechanical, rhythmic quiet of recovery. The overhead monitor beeped a steady, hypnotic 65 beats per minute. Sophie slept, her chest rising and falling with the artificial aid of the oxygen mask, but the terrifying, high-pitched whistle of the Strider was gone. The immediate war was over, leaving behind the debris of the battle, wrappers on the floor, open drawers, and a 10-year-old girl sitting in a plastic chair that was too big for her. Alice handed Leah a juice box. It was a small, mundane object, grape, with a bent yellow straw, but it served as a bridge between the clinical emergency and the reality that there was a child sitting in the room. Leah took it, but she didn't drink. She held it in both hands, staring at the cartoon character on the side, the cold condensation gathering on her thumbs. "Leah?" Alice asked gently, pulling her rolling stool closer so she wasn't looming over the girl. Most 10-year-olds don't know the word anaphylaxis. They definitely don't know the dosage for an EpiPen or the name of the thigh muscle. Where did you learn that? Leah turned the juice box over in her hands, her movements slow and deliberate. "Dr. Evans taught us. Not this Dr. Evans, our allergist." She looked up, her eyes dry and serious, devoid of the playfulness usually found in a 4th grader. "Sophie has a severe allergy to bee venom. We found out when she was 2. Dad says we have to be ready because the ambulance takes too long where we live." It wasn't just knowledge, it was indoctrination. As Leah spoke, she painted a picture of a family life defined not by leisure, but by vigilance. She explained the routine. Every first Saturday of the month, the family held a drill. They didn't play board games or watch cartoons on those mornings. They practiced saving Sophie. They used oranges from the kitchen fruit bowl to practice the injection force. Blue to the sky, Orange to the thigh, she recited, a rhyme that had likely just saved her sister's life. Leah described how the skin of the orange mimicked the resistance of human muscle, teaching her exactly how hard she had to swing her arm to trigger the spring-loaded needle. But it went deeper than rhymes. Leah described how her father would use a stopwatch. She had to recognize the signs: a cough, a scratch at the throat, a specific change in skin color, retrieve the trainer pen, and administer the dose in under 30 seconds. If she fumbled the safety cap, they started over. If she hesitated, they started over. "I can do it in 12 seconds now," Leah said. There was no pride in her voice, only the flat reporting of a metric. "Today it took longer. My hands were wet. I almost dropped it." Alice listened, realizing that what she had witnessed, the calm entry, the precise report, the refusal to panic, wasn't a miracle. It was the result of a childhood militarized by the threat of sudden death. Leah hadn't been raised just to be a sister. She had been raised to be a lifeguard. "And the phone?" Alice asked, thinking back to the hiking trail and the confusion about the parents. "You said you didn't have it. But if your dad is that prepared—" "I had it," Leah corrected. "It was in the go bag. Dad makes us carry it whenever we hike. It has the extra EpiPens, the Benadryl, 2 liters of water, and the satellite phone." "Where is the bag now?" "I left it at the creek," Leah said. The logic she explained next chilled Alice to the bone. When Sophie collapsed, Leah had tried to pick her up with the tactical backpack still strapped to her shoulders. It was too heavy. The physics didn't work. She couldn't move fast enough with the supplies and the patient. So, she made a command decision. She took the one EpiPen she had in her pocket, injected Sophie, and then abandoned the bag. She left the water. She left the phone. She left the backup medication. She traded communication and safety for speed. "I knew if I kept the bag we'd be too slow," Leah whispered, staring at the floor. "I knew if I left it, I couldn't call for help. But she stopped breathing. I had to choose." The calculation was brutal and perfect. A 10-year-old girl stood on a lonely trail, looked at her dying sister, and stripped away everything that wasn't essential to survival. She accepted the risk of being cut off from the world to buy the velocity needed to reach it. But as Leah looked at Sophie's sleeping face, the stoicism finally cracked. It wasn't fear of the event that broke through. It was guilt. "I didn't sweep the rock," Leah confessed, her voice trembling for the first time since the adrenaline crash. Protocol is to sweep the area before she sits down. I was looking at a bird. I didn't check for the nest underneath." She didn't see herself as the hero who carried her sister a mile. She saw herself as the negligent sentry who had allowed the enemy inside the perimeter. The weight on her shoulders wasn't just the physical memory of Sophie's body. It was the crushing burden of a responsibility that no child should ever have to bear. The belief that she was a failed system because the accident happened at all. The peace in Trauma Bay 1 was a lie, a temporary ceasefire negotiated by chemistry that was already beginning to break down. To the casual observer, the room had settled into the quiet rhythm of recovery. The nurses had stepped away to chart, the frantic energy of the initial code had dissipated, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. 65 beats per minute, green and regular. But Leah wasn't a casual observer. She was a sentry who had been trained to never trust the silence. She sat on the edge of the oversized plastic chair, the juice box forgotten in her lap, her eyes glued to the screen above her sister's bed. She didn't blink. She didn't relax. While Alice typed notes into the computer workstation a few feet away, Leah watched the green line trace its path across the black void of the monitor. Then, the rhythm changed. It wasn't an alarm. It wasn't a crisis. Not yet. It was a subtle skip, a slight acceleration where the heart rate jumped from 65 to 72, then to 80 in the span of 10 seconds. The oxygen saturation number flickered, 98, 97, 95. Leah stood up. The motion was so abrupt, so silent, that Alice spun around in her chair. "Leah?" Alice asked, her hands hovering over the keyboard. "What's wrong?" "It's coming back," Leah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a terrifying vibration of certainty. "The numbers. She's dumping." Alice looked at the monitor. "Honey, she's still at 95%. That's normal. The heart rate is just—" "No," Leah interrupted, stepping toward the bed, her hand reaching out but afraid to touch. "It's biphasic. Dad said it can happen. The second wave." Before Alice could offer a reassurance, the biology in the bed confirmed the child's fear. Sophie, who had been sedated and peaceful, suddenly arched her back. Her eyes flew open, wide and unseeing, filled with a primal, suffocating panic. She gasped, a terrible, wet sound that seemed to originate from the bottom of her chest. The high-pitched whistle of the Strider, which had vanished 20 minutes ago, returned with a vengeance, louder and sharper than before. It sounded like a zipper being pulled up quickly, sealing her throat shut from the inside. The monitor exploded into noise. The yellow caution light turned to a flashing red. Heart rate 140. Oxygen saturation 82. The numbers were free-falling. The swelling hadn't just returned, it had rebounded with the stored energy of a compressed spring. "Get Evans back in here," Alice shouted, abandoning the computer and lunging for the oxygen mask, trying to create a seal over Sophie's face. "Respiratory! We're losing the airway!" The doors crashed open. Dr. Evans, who hadn't even made it back to his desk, sprinted into the room, followed by the same team that had dispersed only moments ago. The calm atmosphere shattered instantly, replaced by a frantic, high-stakes violence. This wasn't the controlled entry of the first triage. This was a crash. Leah was pushed back by the swarm of scrubs. She hit the wall hard but didn't look away. She watched as the hives on Sophie's neck, which had started to fade, bloomed again in angry, bright red patches, spreading visibly across her jawline like a fast-moving fire. The first reaction had been a warning. This was the main event. "Biphasic reaction," Evans yelled over the alarm, his hands moving to Sophie's jaw, trying to thrust it forward to open the passage. "The histamine load is too high. The second dose isn't holding it. Saturation is 75 and dropping. She's fighting for every breath." Leah flinched. It was a small, sharp movement, a crack in her armor that she couldn't hide. She had done the drills. She had memorized the dosages. She had carried the weight. But the drills always ended with the injection. The drills said that if you did everything right, the patient lived. They never covered what happened when you did everything perfectly and the body still decided to die. Sophie was thrashing now, her small hands clawing at the air, fighting the invisible hands that were choking her. It was the most terrifying sight a sibling could witness. The person you love most in the world drowning in plain sight. Dr. Evans looked at the monitor, then at Sophie's blue lips. He stopped trying to reposition the mask. The time for medication was over. The time for mechanics had begun. "We can't wait for another round of meds," Evans announced, his voice dropping into the grim, flat register of a final decision. "Her airway is closing completely. Prepare to intubate. Get the glide scope. I need a 4.0 tube, cuffed, now." The order hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Intubation wasn't a treatment. It was a rescue. It meant taking over the most basic function of life because the body had surrendered. Leah pressed her back against the wall, her hands covering her mouth, watching as the metal tray of instruments was wheeled forward, the cold steel of the laryngoscope glinting under the harsh trauma lights. The false summit was over. They were back on the cliff edge. The transition from emergency management to the intubation protocol is a shift from chaotic defense to calculated, sterile offense. The room didn't just get quieter, it changed texture. The frantic energy of the biphasic crash was replaced by a terrifying geometric precision. A nurse wheeled a stainless steel tray to the head of the bed, the metal clattering softly, a sound that signaled the escalation better than any alarm. On the tray lay the instruments of invasion, the laryngoscope with its curved steel blade, the endotracheal tubes in varying sizes still sealed in sterile plastic, the syringe for the cuff, and the suction catheter. A nurse, responding to the innate hospital dogma that protects civilians from the brutality of medical procedures, turned toward the corner. Her eyes were kind, but her posture was firm. She moved to intercept Leah, her hand reaching out to guide the 10-year-old toward the sliding glass doors. "Honey, you need to step out now," the nurse said, her voice dropping to that practiced, soothing register used to manage relatives. "The doctors need room to work. It's going to be scary to watch. Go wait with Alice in the hall." Leah didn't retreat. She didn't look at the nurse. Her eyes were locked on Sophie, who was still thrashing against the restraints, her small face contorted in a silent scream of air hunger. Leah planted her feet, her dirty sneakers gripping the floor with the immovable weight of a guardian statue. "No," Leah said. It wasn't a petulant refusal. It was a clinical correction. "She's panicking. Look at the monitor. Her heart rate is 160. It's not just the hypoxia, it's the fear. If she fights the sedation, you can't get the view. You'll miss the chords." The nurse blinked, stunned by the logic. Leah continued, her voice trembling slightly but her words laser-focused. "I'm the only face she knows here. If I leave, she thinks she's alone. If I stay, she stays still." Dr. Evans, who was rapidly checking the light on his laryngoscope blade, looked up. He saw the logic instantly. He saw a patient who was fighting the team, burning precious oxygen with every thrashing movement. He looked at Leah, small, fierce, and absolutely right. "Let her stay," Evans barked, cutting off the nurse's protest. He pointed a gloved finger at the foot of the bed. "You, stand at the feet. Hold her ankles. Do not move. Do not speak. You are her anchor. Can you do that?" Leah nodded once. She moved instantly, ducking under the tangle of IV lines and monitor cables to position herself at the end of the gurney. She took Sophie's ankles in her hands. Her grip wasn't tight, but it was solid, a physical transmission of presence. She leaned forward, catching Sophie's terrified, rolling eyes. "I'm right here, Soph," Leah whispered, her voice cutting under the hiss of the high-flow oxygen. "Just look at me. Squeeze my hand. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie's eyes locked onto her sister's face. The thrashing slowed. The desperate arching of her back eased. The heart rate on the monitor ticked down. 155. 150. It was enough. "Pushing meds," the anesthesiologist announced. "Etomidate and rocuronium in." Leah felt the change before she saw it. The tension in Sophie's legs simply vanished. The chemical curtain fell, paralyzing the muscles instantly to allow the doctors to work. Sophie's chest stopped moving. Her eyelids fluttered and closed. She went unnaturally, terrifyingly limp in Leah's hands. To a layman, it looked like death. To Leah, who had read the books, it was the necessary suspension of life required to save it. But knowing the science didn't stop the cold horror of feeling her sister's resistance evaporate into nothingness. "Bag her," Evans ordered. The respiratory therapist clamped the bag valve mask over Sophie's face, squeezing rhythmic breaths into the still lungs. Whoosh. Whoosh. "Sats are holding at 85. Going in." Evans tilted Sophie's head back, opening the mouth. He inserted the laryngoscope, the steel blade sliding over the tongue, lifting the soft tissue out of the way to reveal the hidden architecture of the throat. The room fell into a silence so deep it felt pressurized. The only sounds were the beep of the monitor and the wet, harsh gurgle of the suction catheter clearing the airway. Leah didn't look at the procedure. She didn't want to see the steel in her sister's throat. She stared at Sophie's motionless feet, her thumbs rubbing small, rhythmic circles into the skin of her sister's ankles. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. She was the lifeline, the battery keeping the connection alive while the machine was rebooted. "I have the view," Evans murmured, his voice tight with concentration. "Cords are visible. Tube." The nurse slapped the plastic tube into his hand. He threaded it carefully, past the teeth, past the tongue, through the vocal cords and into the trachea. "Tube is in, style it out. Bag." The therapist reconnected the bag and squeezed. Everyone in the room turned their eyes to the small plastic square attached to the end of the tube, the colorimetric detector. If it stayed purple, the tube was in the stomach and Sophie would die. If it turned yellow, gold, it meant carbon dioxide was returning from the lungs. Purple. Purple. Leah stopped breathing. She squeezed the ankles harder. Yellow. A collective exhale swept through the room, a physical release of pressure. "We have gold," Evans announced, the tension draining from his shoulders. "Good bilateral breath sounds. Secure the tube. Hook her up to the vent." The mechanical ventilator was wheeled over and connected with a click. The machine took over. Hiss, click, whoosh. Sophie's chest rose. Hiss, click, whoosh. It fell. It was a mechanical, artificial rhythm, completely different from the desperate gasping of before. It was the sound of safety. Leah slumped forward, her forehead resting against the mattress at her sister's feet, her hands still clutching the ankles, shaking uncontrollably as the realization washed over her. The machine had her now. Sophie was safe, but she was gone, drifting in a chemically induced sleep, leaving Leah alone in the waking world. The curtain surrounding Trauma Bay 1 offered visual privacy. A flimsy barrier of patterned fabric meant to shield the vulnerable from the prying eyes of the corridor, but it did nothing to stop sound. Inside the bay, the rhythmic hiss and click of the ventilator had become the new baseline of existence, a mechanical lullaby that had finally allowed Leah's shoulders to slump. But outside that curtain, the atmosphere was shifting again. The frantic, rubber-soled squeak of nurses was replaced by the heavy, deliberate clatter of tactical boots. A police officer stood at the nurses' station. He wasn't there to offer comfort. He was there because a computer algorithm had flagged a specific set of criteria. A child with life-threatening injuries, admitted without a legal guardian present. In the eyes of the state, this wasn't a medical miracle yet. It was a potential crime scene. Alice stepped out to meet him, her face still marked with the fatigue of the code. She spoke in hushed tones, but the acoustics of the emergency department carried her voice over the partition. The officer, a man whose uniform seemed too loud and too stiff for the sterile environment, held a small notebook. His pen hovered over the paper, ready to categorize the tragedy. "So, no parents on site?" the officer stated, not asking a question but confirming a box he needed to check. "And you said they were hiking? Alone?" "They were on the trail with the parents," Alice corrected gently, her protective instinct flaring. "The parents were behind them. The older sister ran ahead to get help." The officer's pen scratched against the paper. It was a harsh, dry sound. "Run ahead? With a 4-year-old? Ma'am, that trail is 3 miles from the nearest road. That's a long way for 2 kids to be unsupervised." The word unsupervised drifted over the curtain rail and landed in the trauma bay like a stone. It carried a weight that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with judgment. It implied negligence. It implied that the terror Leah had just survived was born from carelessness rather than misfortune. Inside the bay, Leah's head snapped up. She had been staring at the rise and fall of Sophie's chest, counting the breaths, anchoring herself to the rhythm. But the officer's voice had broken the trance. The exhaustion that had pinned her to the chair a moment ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp heat in her chest. She looked at her dirty sneakers. She looked at the mud on her knees. She thought of the drills, the stopwatch, the orange peels. "I need to know why the parents weren't carrying the child," the officer continued, his voice dropping but staying firm. "If the kid was sick enough to need a tube down her throat, why did they send a 10-year-old to do the heavy lifting? It doesn't add up." Alice opened her mouth to defend the invisible parents, to explain the physics of the situation, but she was cut off. The curtain rings rattled violently as the fabric was swept aside. Leah stood in the opening. She looked impossibly small next to the high-tech machinery, a disheveled figure in a torn t-shirt and mud-caked jeans. But she didn't look down. She looked directly at the officer's belt, then up to his face. Her eyes were dry, burning with a fierce, terrifying intelligence that made the officer pause mid-sentence. "They didn't send me," Leah said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the same steel edge she had used to command the trauma room. "I took her." The officer blinked, looking down at the girl. He softened his posture slightly, shifting from interrogator to adult talking to child. "Hey there, I'm just trying to understand what happened, okay? We just want to make sure you guys are safe at home." "We're safe," Leah interrupted, stepping fully into the hallway. She didn't back down. "My dad carries the 60-pound pack because he's the strongest. My mom carries the water in the tent. I carry the sat phone and the med kit because I'm the fastest runner. That's the protocol." She used the word protocol, not like a child playing pretend, but like a soldier explaining the rules of engagement. She pointed a trembling finger back toward the intubated figure of her sister. "When she got stung, the airway started closing in 2 minutes. Dad was a mile back at the ridge switchback. If I waited for him to catch up, she would have stopped breathing before he got there. If I waited for him to take her, we would have lost 10 minutes. Leah took a step closer to the officer. The adult that had emerged during the triage process was back, fueled by a defensive rage on behalf of the parents who had trained her for this exact nightmare. "I calculated the weight," she said, reciting the logic she had used on the trail. "I knew I couldn't carry the bag and Sophie, so I left the bag. I knew the dosage because my dad quizzes me every Saturday. If they were bad parents, I wouldn't know what epinephrine was. If they were negligent, she would be dead right now." The officer stood motionless. The pen had stopped moving. He looked from the fierce, shaking girl to the nurse, and then to the small, silent form on the ventilator. He had walked in expecting a story of abandonment, of children left to fend for themselves by careless adults. Instead, he was facing the product of a family that had prepared for disaster with almost military precision. "She didn't survive because we were lucky," Leah finished, her voice finally cracking as the anger gave way to the underlying grief. "She survived because we practiced." The silence that followed was absolute. The officer slowly closed his notebook. He clipped the pen back into his pocket. The bureaucratic need to find fault, to categorize this as a failure of supervision, withered under the glare of the 10-year-old girl. He looked at Alice, an unspoken apology in his eyes, and then nodded respectfully to Leah. "Okay," he said softly. "I understand. You did good." He turned and walked away, his heavy boots sounding much quieter on the linoleum this time, leaving Leah standing guard at the threshold of the room, the defender of her family's honor as well as her sister's life. The quiet that the police officer left behind was fragile, a temporary vacuum in a room designed for noise. It lasted for perhaps 3 minutes, just long enough for the rhythmic hiss-click whoosh of the ventilator to settle back into the subconscious of the medical team. Then, the world outside the trauma bay exploded again. It started at the triage desk, 40 feet away. It wasn't the mechanical alarm of a code or the controlled urgency of a medical page. It was a sound that every emergency room veteran dreads more than any other. The raw, uninhibited screaming of parents who believe they have arrived too late. There were frantic voices, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the automatic doors before they could fully slide open, and the chaotic scuffling of security trying to intercept a force of nature. Alice was already moving before the page came overhead. She knew who it was. She stepped out of the trauma bay just as the parents rounded the corner into the main hallway. They didn't look like the prepared, organized hikers Leah had described. They looked like the survivors of a shipwreck. The mother was leading, her face a mask of absolute, blinding terror. She was missing a shoe. Her jeans were torn at the knees, soaked in mud, evidence of the brutal terrain she had just scrambled over. Behind her, the father was sprinting, his chest heaving with the desperate gasps of a man who had run 3 miles at full tilt. He was still wearing the heavy tactical backpack, the 60-pound burden he hadn't thought to drop, or perhaps couldn't bear to let go of because it contained the supplies that hadn't been there when his daughters needed them. They had found the abandoned go bag at the creek. They had found the empty spot on the trail where their children should have been. And they had found the silence. For the last 40 minutes, they had been running toward a hospital, fueled by the terrifying logic that finding the bag meant Leah had made a choice. They just didn't know if the choice had worked. Alice intercepted them 10 feet from the door. She didn't try to physically stop them, she knew she couldn't, but she stepped into their path, raising her hands in a gesture that was meant to ground them. "She's here," Alice said, her voice sharp and loud enough to cut through their panic. "She is alive. Do you hear me? She is alive." The mother stopped so abruptly she almost fell. The word alive seemed to hit her physical form like a blow, stealing the momentum that had carried her off the mountain. She grabbed Alice's arms, her grip bruising, her eyes wide and searching. Where is she?" "She's in Trauma 1, Alice said, keeping her voice steady, preparing them for the violence of the visual they were about to see. "Listen to me. She had a second reaction. She stopped breathing. We had to put a tube in. A machine is breathing for her right now. It looks scary, but it is saving her life. She is safe." The father pushed forward, his face gray with exhaustion, sweat dripping from his nose. Did Leah... He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't ask if his 10-year-old daughter had managed to navigate a medical crisis that would have paralyzed most adults. "Leah is with her," Alice said. "Leah got her here." Alice turned and opened the door. The parent surged past her, the heavy backpack knocking against the doorframe as the father squeezed through. The room was dim, lit mostly by the glow of the monitors and the harsh exam light focused on the bed. The mechanical rhythm of the ventilator filled the space. Hiss. Click. Whoosh. The mother made a sound that wasn't quite a sob. It was a low, guttural keen of pain. She saw the plastic tube taped to her 4-year-old's face. She saw the restraints on the small wrists. She saw the rise and fall of the chest that was too rhythmic, too mechanical to be natural. She collapsed. She didn't faint. She simply lost the ability to stand, sinking to her knees beside the gurney, her hands reaching out to touch Sophie's arm, terrified to disturb the wires, but desperate to connect. The father didn't collapse. He stood at the foot of the bed, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the room with the same terrifying analytical intensity that Leah had shown earlier. He looked at the monitor, heart rate 110, oxygen saturation 99, stable. He looked at the IV lines. He looked at the intubation tube. He assessed the tactical situation before he allowed himself to feel it. Then he looked into the corner. Leah was still standing there. She hadn't moved when they entered. She stood with her back to the supply cabinet, her hands at her sides, watching him. She looked exhausted, small, and incredibly dirty. The adult facade was starting to crumble, but she held it for one more second. The father locked eyes with her. It was a silent, heavy exchange that bypassed the mother's grief and the medical team's activity. He looked at her, and in his eyes was the question that had been burning in his chest since he found the abandoned bag on the trail. "Did you execute the protocol? Did you do what we practiced?" Leah looked at him. She didn't run to him. She didn't cry. She simply nodded. It was a single, sharp motion of her chin. Affirmative. Mission accomplished. The father let out a breath that sounded like a sob breaking loose. The soldier vanished, replaced by a terrified dad. He crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to his knees in front of her. He didn't say a word. He just pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her dirty, sweat-stained hair, his heavy arms wrapping around her small frame, shielding her from the room, from the trauma, from the weight she had carried alone for 3 miles. And finally, buried in the safety of the commander who had come to relieve her, Leah closed her eyes and let herself be a child again. The immediate, suffocating panic of the parents' arrival began to recede, replaced by the grim, structured reality of the medical debrief. Dr. Evans stepped away from the bedside, motioning for the father, David, to join him near the workstation. It was a deliberate move, a physical separation of the emotional center of the room from the clinical facts. David went, though his eyes remained tethered to the bed where his wife was now stroking Sophie's hair, whispering broken reassurances into the plastic tubing. Dr. Evans didn't sugarcoat the situation, but he offered the one thing David needed most, a verdict on the timeline. He pulled up the digital chart, pointing to the timestamp of the triage entry. "She is stable, David," Evans said, his voice low and gravelly. "The ventilator is doing the work for her lungs right now because they're too tired to do it themselves. But you need to understand something. The intubation we just did? That was the finish line. The race was won an hour ago." David wiped a hand across his face, smearing sweat and dirt into his stubble. He looked at the doctor, trying to process the words through the fog of his own adrenaline. "The second reaction. I thought we lost her." "The second reaction was bad," Evans admitted. "But without that first dose of epinephrine at the creek, and without the immediate transport, there wouldn't have been a second reaction to treat. Sophie would have arrested on the trail." Evans paused, looking past the father to the small figure slumped in the plastic chair in the corner. "Your oldest daughter didn't just call for help. She bought the golden hour. She executed a perfect medical intervention in a hostile environment." David turned to look at Leah. He looked back at Dr. Evans and then down at his own watch. A frown creased his forehead, a different kind of confusion settling in. "Wait," David said, his voice taking on a sharp, questioning edge. "What time did she walk in here?" "Triage log says 2:42, Evans replied. David stared at the doctor. He shook his head slowly. That's not right. We hit the trailhead at 1:50. The sting happened 10 minutes later at the 4-mile marker. I checked the time because I was logging the reaction start." The math hung in the air between the two men. Dr. Evans, a man of science, and David, a man who clearly knew the terrain, did the calculations simultaneously. The 4-mile marker was, by definition, 4 miles from the parking lot. The hospital was another 5 miles of road from there. Even if Leah had flagged a car immediately upon reaching the road, which she hadn't mentioned, the timeline was physically punishing. "She covered 4 miles of rough trail in under 40 minutes, David whispered, the blood draining from his face as the realization hit him, carrying 40 pounds of dead weight. Dr. Evans looked at Leah again. He looked at the thin legs clad in muddy denim, the small arms that were currently wrapped around her own torso. He thought about the physiology of exertion, the lactate threshold, the cardiovascular demand. It wasn't just a run, it was a sprint under load. It was the kind of physical feat that soldiers train for, executed by a 4th grader fueled by nothing but terror and adrenaline. "She didn't walk," Evans said softly, a new level of respect entering his tone. "She ran. She must have sprinted the entire way." The medical team, those within earshot, went silent. They looked at the girl in the corner with a profound sense of awe. They dealt with the human body every day, its frailties, its breaking points. They knew what that kind of effort did to a system. Leah hadn't just been stoic, she had pushed her body past the point of failure and kept going because the alternative was unacceptable. Leah, oblivious to the conversation about her athletics, sat in the oversized chair, her feet barely touching the floor. The commander, who had barked orders about intubation protocols, was gone. In her place sat a small, exhausted child. The rigid posture had collapsed. Her shoulders were rounded, her head bowed. The adrenaline that had acted as a suit of armor for the last 2 hours had finally evaporated, leaving her shivering and raw. Alice moved first. She didn't approach Leah as a nurse approaching a colleague this time. She walked over to the nutrition station and grabbed another juice box, apple this time, and a warm blanket from the warmer. She approached the chair slowly, crouching down so she wasn't looming over the girl. "Leah," Alice said softly. She didn't ask for medical history. She didn't ask for a status report. She simply held out the juice and the blanket. "Drink this. You're shaking." Leah looked up. The 1,000-yard stare, that glassy, terrifying focus that had seen through walls and time, was fading. Her eyes were red-rimmed and heavy. The fierce intelligence was softening into simple, overwhelming fatigue. She took the juice box, her hands trembling so much she couldn't get the straw into the hole. Alice reached out, her hands gentle and warm, and guided the straw in. "I've got it," she whispered. "I've got you. You don't have to do it anymore. Dad is here. Dr. Evans is here. You're off duty, honey." Leah took a sip. The sugar hit her system, and a visible shudder went through her small frame. She pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders, burying her nose in the warm fabric. She looked over the rim of the juice box at her father, who was now holding Sophie's hand, crying silently. She looked at Dr. Evans, who gave her a solemn nod. And finally, she looked at Alice. The soldier was gone. The sister was gone. There was just a little girl who wanted to go to sleep. "Is she going to wake up?" Leah asked, her voice small and thready, stripped of all clinical terminology. "Yes," Alice promised, smoothing the hair back from Leah's sweaty forehead. "She's going to wake up, and when she does, we'll tell her you carried her all the way home." The fluorescent hum of the emergency department changes frequency after 3 in the morning. The frantic, high-voltage energy of the day shift dissolves into a heavy, rhythmic quiet that feels almost underwater. In Trauma Bay 1, the overhead lights had been dimmed to a soft, amber glow, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that had been scrubbed clean of the earlier chaos. The violent symphony of alarms, shouting commands, and tearing Velcro was a distant memory, replaced by the gentle, reassuring beep, beep, beep of a heart beating at a normal rhythm. Sophie was off the ventilator. The tube had been removed an hour ago, leaving her throat sore and her voice raspy, but her lungs were working on their own again. She was curled on her side, a small thumb tucked near her mouth, sleeping the deep, restorative sleep of the survivors. The swelling in her face had receded enough to reveal the little girl underneath, her chest rising and falling with a peaceful, easy cadence that felt like a miracle to anyone who had seen her 2 hours prior. But Alice wasn't watching the patient. She stood in the doorway, a fresh cup of coffee warming her hands, her gaze fixed on the plastic chair in the corner. Leah was asleep. She had finally succumbed to the crushing weight of the day. She was curled into a ball that defied geometry, her head resting on the hard armrest, her legs tucked up against her chest. She looked impossibly young now. The fierce commander who had rattled off dosage calculations and challenged a police officer was gone. In her place was just a 4th grader in a dirty t-shirt, her mouth slightly open, a small drool spot forming on the vinyl. Alice moved closer, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the floor. She looked at Leah's hands. They were resting on her lap, palms up, and in the dim light, Alice could see the physical cost of the trek. There were blisters on her fingers, likely from gripping the straps of the heavy bag before she abandoned it, or from clutching her sister's denim jacket during the carry. There were scratches on her forearms from the briars of the Ridge Trail, angry red lines that had been ignored while the adrenaline was pumping, but would surely sting when she woke up. The parrots were asleep on the pull-out couch in the quiet room next door, finally collapsing after the extubation confirmed Sophie was safe. It was just the sisters now, alone in the sterile sanctuary of the bay. Yet, even in unconsciousness, the instinct remained. Leah's right hand wasn't tucked in with the rest of her body. It was extended slightly, her fingers twitching every time the monitor changed pitch, a subconscious sentry duty that sleep couldn't fully deactivate. Alice walked over to the workstation to finalize the chart. The electronic record was a sterile collection of data points: anaphylaxis, tachycardia, intubation, extubation. It was a cold, digital summary of a hot fire. Alice scrolled down to the pre-hospital care section. Usually, this box was filled with notes about EMS crews, paramedic unit numbers, or response times. Alice deleted the standard template. She typed slowly, wanting the words to matter, even if they were just for the archives. Patient arrived via private transport. Triage assessment performed by sibling, age 10. Epinephrine, 0.15 milligrams, administered IM by sibling at onset of symptoms. Airway managed during transport by sibling. She stared at the words. They felt inadequate. They didn't capture the mile-long sprint or the abandoned go bag. They didn't capture the terror of the biphasic crash or the stoicism of the vigil. But in the medical record, they were a badge of honor. They cemented the fact that Sophie hadn't been saved by a doctor or a nurse or a machine. She had been saved by a 10-year-old girl who refused to accept the alternative. Alice hit save. She looked back at the 2 girls. The dynamic had shifted forever. They would go back to school. They would argue over toys. They would fight over the remote control. But beneath the ordinary friction of childhood, there would always be this night, There would always be the memory of the trail, the weight of the carry, and the knowledge that when the world fell apart, Leah would be the one to hold it together. Alice walked over to the bed and adjusted Sophie's blanket, then gently draped a second warm sheet over Leah's exposed legs. Leah stirred, her brow furrowing for a split second, before settling back into the deep, earned rhythm of sleep. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, illuminating Leah's face. She was no longer pale with terror. Her cheeks were flushed with warm, heavy sleep. The hero of the night didn't wear a cape or a badge. She wore mud-stained sneakers and a sister's devotion. Sometimes, the strongest people in the room are the ones we least expect. If this story of courage moved you, please subscribe for more tales of resilience.